Ivan Ross Vrana. Spent a total of about 13 years with Health Canada, so this guy knows the ins and the outs of the thinking within that institution. And if you have an interest in what's going on in Canada currently, Ivan Ross lets us know. He also gives us a bit of an update of what's happening currently in Australia. So enjoy. All right, excellent. Okay, so we've got Ivan Ross Vrana here from Canada, right?
Absolutely, yes. Thanks for having me, Seth.
Absolutely, our home and native land.
Yeah, yes. That's good, part of the anthem. Perfect.
Absolutely. I had a friend as a kid who was a very big hockey fan who memorized your national anthem and would sing it often. So.
Oh, geez.
Yeah. Well, what are you going to do?
Die hard. Yeah.
Absolutely. So obviously in Canada now. You're from Canada originally, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And where did you grow up? Where did you spend your formative years?
Pretty much all in Ottawa. So I was born in Ottawa. I lived for a while in a small town called Kitchener-Waterloo, but we moved back when I was about 10, and ever since then, I've been trying to get out of the city, but unfortunately, I went to both universities, so I'm stuck here, and my career has been built in Ottawa.
Okay, and which universities are we talking about?
So I did my undergrad at Ottawa University, or University of Ottawa, and I did my master's degree at Carleton University.
Okay, Ottawa University and Carleton University, fantastic. And how did your parents come upon Ottawa? Where are they from?
Well, my dad's originally from what was then called Czechoslovakia, and he's from the Czech Republic. So he came to Canada in 1952, running away from the communists. Or I shouldn't say running away, I should say escaping. And my mom is from Toronto, born and bred, too.
Okay. And then how did
as it were.
Oh, I keep interrupting you. How did they meet if she's from Toronto and he went directly to Ottawa?
Well, sorry, he came to Canada in 52, and then like most immigrants, they would end up in Toronto of all places, and that was a huge immigrant community then and as of today, and so they met. Like many couples, they met at a party.
Excellent, and as far as Toronto is concerned, why did you think your dad choose Canada over what I would want him to choose, the United States?
Well, funny story. Their first choice, my dad and his two brothers, they did want to go to the U.S. because that's what they knew really well. During World War II, part of the American Army under Patton sort of liberated a small part of the Czech Republic, and my dad remembers, going down there and seeing the American soldiers and the jeeps and getting candy from them. But what was happening was, I guess the immigration was taking too long when they were in Austria. And so the Canadians said, well, why don't you come on over with us? We'll get you over for sure. And ever since then, that's where we've ended up.
Okay. So they were just, it was a nice foray in there. Your dad meets your mom in Toronto. And
yes.
How long did they stay there before they get to Ottawa?
They were there for about, a good 10 years, I believe. About 10 years. They came to Ottawa in 1970.
Okay. And then when did Ivan Ross occur to them?
I came along in 1970 also. So
okay.
Right after, yeah.
Fair enough. And you have brothers or sisters?
Yeah, I've got an older sister who was born in Toronto, but of course she ended up in Ottawa also.
Okay. And you spent a fair amount of time with Health Canada, and we want to kind of go through all of those years. And, where do you think, though, your yearning for public service came from?
Well, I think, like a lot of people, it definitely came from both my parents. I mean, my mother, she was a teacher, a lifelong teacher for a good 30 years. During her career. And, my father was a public servant. He, I think, really valued, what Canada and much like the U.S. had to offer in the sense of the freedom and the liberty. And to him, it wasn't just a cliche. It was something he lived by, because when he was in, the Czechoslovakia, he was denied being able to go to university. Was told you're going to work in a sawmill and and his life was very regimented. And when he came here, freedom was something very tangible to him, and you could make your own way. And so he believed in wanting to sort of pay back, and the best way that he could do it with his skills and so forth was to work for the federal government. And that's where that kind of idea of public service came in with our family, both from my mom and my dad.
And did he work for the public?
Yes,
did he work for the government? Okay, what did he do?
He was in the public service for about 30 years too, and so he worked for a lot of different departments. But I guess his specialty was, at the time, believe it or not, sort of communications, but communications within the sense of early computer programming and adapting government programs to that. So some of the very first languages that were coming out, like COBOL, etc.
Oh, wow.
My dad was implementing, but he did start his career as a tax guy, working for the revenue agency. And then just sort of migrated from there.
Oh, from taxes to technology.
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
That's quite a journey. Mm-hmm. And then what did your mother do?
So she was a teacher. She was a French language teacher and an art teacher. And so that was, one of her things was ensuring, because her background, her father was Scottish and her mother was French Canadian. So she grew up speaking, obviously, English and French. Mm-hmm. And she was able to teach French, but also her big passion was art.
Okay. All right. So a nice, you've got some tax, you've got some technology, you've got some art, right? You've got alternative languages happening. So that's all good.
Absolutely.
You mentioned you went to University of Ottawa. What was your major there?
It was history. So I did an honors degree, and it was in European and Canadian history. And for me, I didn't really give any thought in the early 90s to any sort of career at that point. I just wanted to study something I really liked. And, growing up and hearing the stories from my father and from my mother, within the European and the Canadian context, it was always something that I was greatly interested in. Uh-huh. And so I really enjoyed my time there. But like everybody of that generation, and I guess the generations now, having a BA in history, while it teaches you great writing skills and critical thinking, all those types of good things, it's not that easy to get a job. So I had to go do my master's.
I see. And where did you get your master's?
From Carleton. And I did it in specifically in public administration. And
Carleton is also in Ottawa?
Yes, it is. Yeah.
Okay. And so it was during that time, I think, during your university and then master's, that the Ottawa Senators, the hockey team, came into existence. Is that right?
That's absolutely right. I remember going to a couple of the very first games when tickets were still relatively cheap, and they were played in the our old Civic Center here. So it was quite the experience.
Yeah, but if you didn't have what was your hockey team? You had to have had a hockey team before.
Well, we had a junior hockey team in the OHL, the Ontario Hockey League, and that was the Ottawa 67s. But I don't know if I'm much of a Canadian or much of a Czech, because Czech has a strong hockey tradition, but I prefer football, actually. So,
oh, really?
Yeah, so I was a bit of an outlier on that. So I was always a big, CFL, Canadian Football League fan, but of course, the NFL had a huge influence. I loved watching those games too. Oh, wow.
Who was your team? Who was your team in the NFL?
Well, it was for me, it was the Miami Dolphins, and it's still my team today. And that's primarily because, just growing up, I loved those great NFL films. And I remember, watching one of the very first ones on the 72 Dolphins. And from then on, I was just sort of hooked with all the characters. And that was, sort of before Marino, but obviously, during Marino's time. And it was, just, I don't know what it is, but Miami, it's always because of that one documentary.
Yeah, I mean, the 1972 Dolphins were undefeated. They are the only perfect seasoned team in any team sport.
Yeah.
Don Shula as the coach, Larry Zonka as your running back. So
Larry Zonka.
I can understand how a young guy could fall in love with that team. That makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
But knowing that you couldn't be a football fan for your career, knowing that you couldn't be a historian, public administration from Carleton University. So here we go. We're on to what seemingly is a career in public service, right?
Yes, pretty much. Yes.
And where did you first land?
So my last year, I got lucky enough. My last year in university, I got lucky enough to get a sort of, I guess you would call it a contract with a small government agency called the Patent and Medicine Prices Review Board. Uh-huh. And that started my experience sort of in new medicines or pharmaceuticals. and I was hired on as a very junior policy analyst. And a 6-month contract essentially turned into about 2.5 years that I stayed there. But it was great because I was able to, sort of finish my undergrad and not have any debt and start my master's. But that was a really great start because I learned about the whole sort of pharmaceutical regime in Canada, a little bit of the history about it, and primarily at that time for Canada. It was a larger learning curve because I guess the entire world market in the industry was changing quite a lot at that point.
Mm-hmm. And for us Americans, the Patented Medicine Prices Review Board is a very interesting grouping of words. What does that actually mean?
Well, yeah, no kidding. It's an interesting grouping of words. It's what government excels at, right?
Yeah.
Because given we're a federation, a confederation, there are certain things that the feds are allowed to do, and there are certain things that the provinces have jurisdiction over, just like your states and your federal government. And sort of at that time in the late 80s, the government had been looking into sort of our licensing regime for brand new medicines, for medicines that had patent. And Canada had a compulsory licensing regime at that point. And it wasn't staying in the norm with world standards, especially when the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trades was coming in, and a whole bunch of free trade agreements were coming up. So the government of the day decided to say, okay, well, we'll finally grant, we'll get rid of the compulsory licensing and we'll grant a patent term of 13 years. Mm-hmm. So the companies could have that exclusivity, and the idea was to sort of build up our own sort of research and development within pharmaceuticals. The trade-off was, though, they created a special agency to say, you have that, but you're not going to be allowed to charge whatever you think is appropriate. We're going to tell you not what the price is, but what we think an excessive price is. And that's how it got started, and that's what the agency does and does to this day.
Okay, so it's guidelines, so to speak.
Yes, yeah, right. Guidelines, policies, yeah,
all
absolutely.
Right. So you did that for a little bit. You got your feet wet with some pharmaceuticals, with a little bit of patent work. Where did you go from there?
From there, then I directly went into Health Canada, and I went into a part of Health Canada called the Health Policy Branch. But again, it had responsibility for pharmaceutical policy writ large, but specifically because I guess the feds to some degree, we were looking at a large amount of data that we hadn't seen before, and with our public programs within the provinces. The provinces sort of wanted to get a better handle on sort of what was happening within the pharmaceutical industry and what they were paying for at that time with their drug plan benefits. So I worked on what we call federal, provincial, territorial area FPT relations when it came to pharmaceuticals, and that was sort of learning from each jurisdiction, sharing the information, looking if there were areas that we could collaborate to better improve essentially access to medicines, but also reasonable access vis-a-vis price. Okay.
So you're still kind of working on price, but a little bit more on access and a little bit more focused on the constituents, on the consumers.
Yes.
Okay. All right. And how long did you stay in that position there?
Oh, that was a good, I would imagine about 4 years, 4 or 5 years, I think, something like that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And what was the change that happened along the way in that position? If you've got 4 or 5 years, this is around the, 2000, right?
A little bit earlier than that, actually.
Oh,
like maybe, yeah, 3-4 years. Yeah. Early 2000s, you're right, or late 90s. The changes were, it was just, I think it was a fascinating place and time to be at, because it was one of those opportunities where, you think there's a long history in there about understanding pharmaceutical prices in Canada, for instance, and understanding the global market, but there really wasn't at that point, right? There was some sort of understanding, but digging deep into what the data had and how you use that to design sort of policies that, make it better for the provinces to understand sort of what their requirements are, where we could harmonize certain things. Also to the point where, how do you approve drugs, right? And how you do that sort of cost-benefit analysis. That's the type of work we did. Mm-hmm. And a large part of what came out of that later on was, with the provinces and the federal government, they created an organization called CADTH, and that stands for the Canadian Agency, I believe, on Drugs and Technologies. And health assessment, something along those lines. And that's an agency now that, is if you're introducing a brand new pharmaceutical, the provinces have bought in. Health Canada still approves it specifically for safety and efficacy, but looking at the cost-benefit of side of the things, this is what this agency does. And we were sort of doing it, amongst ourselves at that point with the provinces, but this is what kind of came out as a formalized institution.
And so take us through, for anybody listening in Canada, take us through the relationship between Health Canada and the provinces, and what provinces can do beyond Health Canada or outside of Health Canada, so that we understand the interworking there.
Well, sure. There's always a bit of like it is with the U.S. There's always that kind of tension, right, between the two jurisdictions. I think Health Canada has a very distinct role. I mean, one of the roles it does is it has its own drug plan. Essentially, it's one of the fourth largest for providing for Aboriginals and First Nations, also for the RCMP and Veterans Affairs. And what the department does extremely well is it's equivalent to your Food and Drug Administration, whereby it approves a drug for use. The provinces then are essentially the payers, right? And so they're looking to figure out sort of what their bottom line is and what they can put on their public plans. And some provinces have universal, some have a tiered strategy. And they come up with their various sort of pricing regimes. And then over that, you sort of have, going back to the PMPRB, saying, in Canada overall, this is what we deem as an excessive price. Mm-hmm. And so within that, you've got all these interactions, right? I mean, the provinces all want to try to get the best deal from the large multinationals. Health Canada is in there saying this drug is good or not good, or we need more clinical trial data, et cetera, et cetera. Mm-hmm. And then you're looking at it from a cost-benefit analysis from CADIC and from the PMPRB.
So that 4 or 5 year period, you are dealing directly with that kind of tension, with that, push and pull or tug and pull, or however you want to describe it, right?
Yeah, and it was a fascinating time because also at that time, one of the major files that I started to work on, our Canadian dollar was so low, it was roughly about 60 cents American. Mm-hmm. You had this phenomenon start creeping up about internet pharmacies. And that was, again, brand new for Canada, where you had a lot of them located out west. And they were essentially shipping to the States at a huge discount, right? So you had a lot of American consumers buying it because it was a heck of a lot cheaper. And so that caused a lot of problems because, why they were approved for safety and efficacy in Canada, getting across the border is always a challenge. There's some jurisdictional issues there. The FDA in the U.S. was not happy with it at all. Mm-hmm. One of the famous quotes I remember is the FDA commissioner at the time sort of called Canada a bunch of parasites because, here we are, 2% of the market, not really contributing to the R&D where the U.S. was. So, it was interesting to see the rhetoric go back and forth. And, it was just simply some intelligent people took advantage of the arbitrage and tried selling it, even though it was still, illegal. But, you had those famous bus trips of seniors coming up to Canada and buying their drugs and then heading home, right? And you had some municipalities in the States looking at, supplying it. And it caused tension, from an industry because to some degree, I could be, I'm sure people would disagree with me on this, but the Canadian CEOs were like, this is great because we're selling a lot more, except it was undercutting the price of their cousins in the States, right?
Right.
So, fascinating times, the whole internet pharmacy. And then, of course, when the dollar started to rise again, that kind of ended that whole phenomenon.
That helped out that situation to kind of calmed it down, right?
Yeah, and the government also started introducing a lot more controls in and around that too, about what you can and cannot export.
So you're right there in the mix, admittedly as a younger guy, so at a lower level. But, why make a change from that position?
Well, why make a change from that position? That's the one thing I love about working. I loved working sorry, I'm not explaining myself very well. I loved working for the federal government is because it's a learning organization, right? You're always constantly challenged, and it may seem like a cliche, but it was something where you're challenged to learn about something like internet pharmacies. Give me a break. I had never heard of that, never understood it. Next thing you know, you're right into it, and you have to learn it because you're going to probably come up with some sort of policy or regulation that's going to affect the lives of Canadians. and a much larger audience if it's international, right? And so, I was always sort of looking for those opportunities that would challenge it. I didn't want to get, it's great to be comfortable and know what you're doing. I mean, I did stay with the department for a very long time, but to move around in the department because it's so large and offers so many different opportunities, I was always trying to figure that out and see where.
So what was the next step for you then?
Well, part of my career, what I went to was something completely different. I went over to Finance Canada, and that's our department or central agency that sets the budget and all that kind of lovely good stuff. And so I spent about 2 years there, and I was in a group that looked at the Canadian Health and Social Transfer, and that's a vehicle that we use where the federal government transfers money to the provinces, sort of on an equal basis, to run and help with their social programs. Our equalization program was part of that to sort of bring up all the provinces up to par on a set of standards. That was interesting work. I'm really glad I went there, but I would not go there again because quite heavy into the economics, which I am not an expert in whatsoever. I mean, I love to look at it and read it, but holy smokes, numbers are not my thing, and that's what they were all about.
So then back to Health Canada, I guess?
Yeah, back to Health Canada, and then I went into an area, it was called a Health Products and Food branch, and it was looking at pharmaceuticals, but part of that I also transitioned over into the consumer safety product area, and that was an area where it's looking at consumer products essentially. Are they safe to be on the market like kids' toys? But another part of that is they run the tobacco program and they're responsible for narcotics in Canada. So I was in a policy area where I was the director of policy, and we were looking at things like alcohol policy at that time. And I ran also a small shop on accountability and planning for that branch. And so again, some very, very interesting challenges. That period I loved a lot, actually. It was quite interesting.
Well, what kind of policies were you looking at in terms of, you said you're overseeing narcotics and alcohol. What kind of policies were you looking at? What kind of policies were changing? How was it going?
Well, yeah, the big one that we spent a lot of time on was, at that time we had sort of a minority government. And so at that point within our legislative system, private members' bills become very, very interesting and have a chance of really succeeding if they don't have the government's backing. And there was a movement, a bill that went through various readings looking at putting labels on all alcohol products. And I believe the U.S. does do that. Warning against drinking when you're pregnant. And specifically, I guess this member of parliament was trying to tackle the issue of fetal alcohol spectrum disorder. And our minister at the time was behind it. But, to get it through the legislative process, the regulatory process, the legal process, that's what we spent our time, and to see, what we could do with the money and what the labels would look like and what the implications were and how they would be implemented. I mean, I think we spent a good year and a half just on that alone. But that was, that was a really good introduction for me about understanding, the complete series of levels in government right up to the cabinet and working through that process at that time. So
how do you mean? Take us a level deeper there.
Well, I mean, as the civil servants, you're essentially tasked with coming up with a policy saying this is what we're going to do and implement it. But of course, it has to get buy-in from the other departments, but also from the politicians, right? And there's a formal process, and this is actually something I teach at Concordia and Carleton universities. There are the tools that you have to develop so, the politicians who are elected on our behalf can make a decision, right? And you have your recommendations in there, and you give them options, but it's a formal process. And it's essentially, getting to the point where if you approve this is what we're going to do next, and this is what we're going to now have on the ground and looks like in Canada. And at that time, it was, okay, this is what all alcohol products will have to be labeled with this sort of warning. Unfortunately, it didn't happen, or fortunately, it depends on which side you sit on, because the government then fell and there was an election, so that stuff died on the order paper.
Right.
But it was fascinating, because then I really saw how, it's people use this term, the machinery of government really comes together. And while there's a lot of criticism, government takes forever, sometimes if it's really forced to move quickly, it certainly can.
Interesting. Yeah. And so you had a little bit of experience there with government coming through for you, as you're putting it, type of thing.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
So, what do you think the key there was? If we're going to try to repeat that, you said it was a minority government. You said another government came in, but what do you think was the glue or the keys there?
Well, I think it's from the civil service point of view. Like I was working for a very competent, great person as my boss. She was the assistant deputy minister, and so key people are it. I mean, I had a great team too. I was extremely lucky in that regard. And then I think it's just the desire on part of the political staff to see this and get it done and sort of help you navigate those roadblocks. And it's not to say that they're not roadblocks, sorry, I'm misusing the term, the steps that you have to go through.
Yeah.
And in some ways they can move faster, but you also have to make sure you do your due diligence, right? And, part of that was a lot of dedication. I mean, I remember at one point, and I was happy to do it, though it wasn't good for my relationship at that time. I worked something like 25 days in a row. So, the notion that civil servants, they're lazy, they don't do a lot, that's not necessarily true, right?
Right.
But it was, it was just because you're right in the midst of something, and that's how it's hard to describe. It's very intangible, but you're right in the center. And it's not necessarily the center of policy or power, but it's the center of creating something brand new, which I think, is a powerful hook, and you can get hooked on it quite quickly.
Absolutely. So, all right. So you're in a great spot, and you're doing great things, and I think that's also a 3 or 4 or 5 year period, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then what was the next step?
Well, so restless feet yet again, but as a public servant, the one thing I was fortunate to have in my career up to that point was a lot of interaction with stakeholders, whether that's various nonprofit groups or advocacy institutions, and I really wanted to go see what it would be like to essentially sit on the other side of the table, because it's great. It's one thing to interact with them, but when you're on the other side, it's a whole different perspective. And so I was fortunate enough, I got a job at Canada's research-based pharmaceutical companies, and that's the industry association that represents the brand name pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer, Merck, Frost, Glaxo. And I worked there for 2 years as the director of government relations, and that was sort of interacting, on all levels of government, whether it was elected officials or the civil service, so that they understood the industry's needs and what was happening with the industry and clarifying certain issues. And that was, I think, a really good proving ground, because it really tested my abilities, I guess, and making those interactions work, and clarifying positions so that everybody could understand what it was within a very short period of time. There's always a lot of talk about the elevator pitch. Well, it does exist, actually. So
right.
you better learn that fairly quickly.
Absolutely. And so you're now then on the other side of things. What was the key difference between the approach from, on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies, opposed to what you had been working on, which is pharmaceutical, policy from the government's perspective? What did you see as the key difference between the thinking?
Well, I think the constituency that we represented was a heck of a lot narrow, right? And it was in that regard, it was I don't want to say it was easier or simpler, but it was more focused. Because this was it. This was our constituency. It was the industry. It was the companies, and that was it. We always tried to draw in a lot of other, whether they were patient groups. Whereas in government, I mean, you have to be able to look at and understand, a multitude of viewpoints, right? Especially in our, federation, where federal provincial relations are always top of mind. So that was quite interesting, and that was, it could make life simpler, but it was still, drawing in a lot of different opinions from a lot of different people. But that was the one big thing where, you could really focus in on an issue and keep on talking about it and hammering away on it, where you weren't pulled in 20 different directions necessarily on the same issue.
Interesting. So there was, it seemed like a lot more focused.
Yeah, because the issues that you're doing are a lot narrower, just as important, but it's, you're dealing with maybe 5 or 6 priorities, whereas in the federal government, you're constantly looking at your priority list, shifting it. It could be 10 to 15, and you have to try to address them in some fashion. Because it's the nature of the government. You can't leave anything really behind, right?
Interesting. So you've got this this great gig, which has all sorts of focused thought and very simple in the context of you don't have 14, 15 different projects going on. Why ever leave?
Well, yeah, that's I guess the perpetual question, right?
Right. Yeah.
I think part of it is as I talked about earlier, it's looking for that next challenge, I guess, and not always getting too comfortable. I don't know where that came from or why that's driving it. It's a bit of restlessness, but at that time anyway, I could say. And it's also seeing, okay, what's the next opportunity if there is one there, and the next one came along and I couldn't pass it up.
Which was what?
And that was, talking to some of my former colleagues at Health Canada and coming back and saying, okay, we've got this marijuana medical access program. We have to fix it. How would you like to do that? And then I jumped at the chance for sure, because it was, again, brand new ground. I didn't know anything about marijuana, right? Some experience with marijuana was maybe smoking 3 or 4 joints in university, and that was about it, right? So,
and you mean over the run of the entire time at university?
Pretty much, yeah.
Right.
Pretty
Okay.
much. And unlike Bill Clinton, I did inhale, but
Right.
That's all I knew about it. And so I thought, again, from a health perspective, from a government perspective, this is a really unique opportunity.
Yeah.
I took it, and I was very glad I did. Though it was one of the most strenuous periods, though, for sure.
Well, let's talk all about it. My first question, though, is what's with the H?
What's with the H? Well, I think, we can blame the Americans for that one. In the sense of, I remember actually getting that question from the minister's staff, and somebody had prepared it, and I looked at it, and it said, well, that's in the regulations. And so I said, that's great. As a history degree, that doesn't tell me anything. Why was it put that way in the H? And so we dug a little deeper, and it looks like what we found within statute, within England, and also in the U.S., when the prohibition started coming in the late 20s, I think there was a decision to distinguish it from, the proper Spanish spelling with the J. So it was put into the tax law at that time, and that's where we simply inherited it from that. We just copied it, yeah. So, funny, right?
Prohibition gets blamed for something else, so that's nice.
Yeah. Absolutely. So that's why we're stuck with the H. But I did notice, Health Canada is going a little schizophrenic, because while the regs say an H, everything on their website now is with a J. So I guess there's room for both, right?
Absolutely. All letters may apply without question.
Yeah.
All right, so let's talk about basically a 3-year period. They brought you back in, basically. They said, hey, we've got this opportunity. You said, okay, let's do it. Take us from the point that you started until you took off, because this is where we do want to focus a lot of time.
Well, sure. I came back in sort of late 2008, and it was, I guess, the old program, or the Marijuana for Medical Access program was having a lot of problems, and the problems were, what was originally envisioned for the program was meant to be a very small program, only, being able to provide marijuana for a couple of indications like cancer or HIV/AIDS or end of life. When it got started sort of in the late 90s, early 2000s, the idea was we wouldn't have more than maybe a couple hundred people in the program. But of course, over time, things change, right? And so it had exploded. The growth was exponential. And the other thing, with our Charter of Rights and Freedoms, like your Bill of Rights, the law kept on getting challenged. So it was, Health Canada, you can't tell how much people are allowed to consume. Health Canada, you can't tell people for what indications it could be used for, right? Because you don't have the science to prove otherwise. And so these court decisions were coming out, and Health Canada's role about approving people to use it as a licensing agency was totally, outside of its scope and expertise. What the department does extremely well is does inspections and make sure that health products, pharmaceuticals, medical devices, etc., are produced in proper conditions and that it's essentially safe to use as best as you can, right? And the other thing is we also, contracted out to a company out in Saskatoon later on that was producing it. And the government wanted to get out of that too. They didn't want to be paying for it explicitly.
Right.
So I was very fortunate yet again where I had inherited a team. And the fascinating was, they took me through briefings, and I remember going through the briefing binders, and they essentially had a solution set to go at that point.
Which was what?
Which was to say, listen, hand it over to industry. And that allows us to do a couple of things. It allows us to get in there and stop people from growing at home, which was important because, no inspections could occur because it was a private residence. It allows, a regulated market supply, and Health Canada then would be able to inspect those who are growing it. And so that was it. And of course, we kept on refining it. But what I found fascinating then is where, if you compare it to sort of the alcohol policy example that I gave you where, there was a straight line, this had a lot of curves and turns and forks in the road because it was such a, contentious issue for the government to be handling at that time. And so it eventually took us about 2 years, 2 to 3 years to finally get it approved by cabinet.
And so this is this 2 year, 3 year period is 2009 to 2012, roughly, correct?
Yeah, 2011, something like that. Yeah.
Okay. And so what you're talking about getting approved is a regulated market supply. Is that right?
Yeah, and produced solely by an industry, a company, right? So you could double check things that, the department could go in and say, okay, how's your quality assurance? Security was always a big concern. What are your security protocols? How are you ensuring no diversion, et cetera, because, regardless of what people think, the law is quite clear. It's still considered a Schedule I drug. It's still a narcotic. And so there are certain rules that have to be followed, right? And so that's where Health Canada could do its job best. Now, I didn't have anything to do with writing the regulations. I had left by that point.
Right.
But I was really happy with the policy. I mean, I guess that sounds like a huge bias, which I do have.
Yeah.
Because I certainly have my opinions on the regulations. But, I thought it was a fairly elegant solution. But of course, we're still dealing with the courts a little bit because that right to grow at home is still being contested. And I think, the courts will settle that. And I'm, happy to see what they come up with, what kind of regime. But I think, if you're going to take this as a medicine, not a recreational drug, it's very important that sort of where it's being produced and how it's being produced. So there is some accountability if you get a bad batch, there's mold on it or whatever reason, right?
Yeah.
Because you're trying to improve your health. I know it's still only dried marijuana, and the only way to really utilize it is smoking or vaporizing it, and that's a whole other issue. But I'm a big believer in that. And even if Canada went, totally recreational like Colorado, I would still want to see, like anything, like alcohol, like food, that you have certain regulations on how you produce a product. You have to have that just for safety reasons, and it's the responsibility of the government to ensure that on behalf of all citizens.
So you set the policy, and again, I want to go into the relationship between the federal government and the provinces. So the standards are set by the federal government. You had a hand in that, not the regulations, just the policy. And then it's the provinces then take that and make their own drug plans. Is that right?
Well, no. In this sense, if they decide to cover it for insurance purposes, they would institute it, and no province has done so yet. So again, like the Patent and Medicine Prices Review Board, why the federal government in Canada has sole responsibility is because Health Canada is responsible for narcotic products. And so therefore it's a federal statute and applies equally across all jurisdictions. So, it's not like the U.S. where, certain states can make the laws. In this case, if Canada says, you can use marijuana for medical purposes, it applies from Nova Scotia right to BC.
And then get into, I guess, let's take this tangent and talk about BC. British Columbia is doing, I would say, different things than maybe the other provinces. Is that a fair way to position it?
Yeah, and I would say yes, to a degree, but specifically, I think it's in and around sort of the distribution of the systems and the dispensaries. And they, of course, are, within the confines of the law. The dispensaries, and the number of them out in Vancouver, are clearly illegal. but they've been illegal now for a long time, and they've been growing exponentially. I think there's about 80 to 100 of them, which is what the latest number is. I mean, for us, there's more medical marijuana dispensaries than there are Tim Hortons, and that's a big deal for a Canadian. So it's that absence of any regulation or any government trying to do something at the federal level. And so, there's that latest ruling in Vancouver where the municipality said, fine, if nobody's going to do anything and not regulate these guys, we will, even though we know it's illegal. But, Health Canada, you're not doing anything. The police are not doing anything, and it's not one of their priorities right now, because they have a lot on their plates also. But so I applaud the city of Vancouver for coming out with that. And trying to put some standards in place. What would have been nice if everybody could have worked together in a fashion with the federal government and the municipality. But sure. You've got hard opinions on both sides, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. And talk through, as far as Vancouver is concerned, how they have the ability to make those standards, to make the dispensaries kind of, or keep the dispensaries in existence. It's fascinating.
Yeah, well, I think it's, the West Coast, much like the U.S., they've always sort of been, I guess, leaders in this kind of area, right? Mm-hmm. And I think, the municipality, Vancouver, showed a lot of leadership, and they're saying, we've got an issue here, we've got a problem, and so we have to deal with it. We can't just bury our head in the sand and hide behind, the legality of it, because in one essence, they're running. I remember, being in Vancouver 4 years ago, and really, the dispensaries, there weren't as many. They were in a part of Vancouver on the downtown east side, which was a rough part of the city. Mm-hmm. And then just going back last fall, and, they were in upscale neighborhoods like Kitsilano with these beautiful shops. And so clearly there's a market there and they're making money. Yeah. And, I do know some people on the Vancouver police force, and I would ask them, how come you guys aren't cracking down on this? And they would say, if we get a complaint, if we hear about it, or, there are kids going in, or there are issues with it, I mean, we'll generally sic the bylaw officers on them. And, this is an official Vancouver police policy. I wouldn't want to speak for them, but that was the general idea that I heard of. Right. Because they're battling other serious issues, and I guess by the mere existence that they've sort of risen up. Yeah. Where it differs from the rest of the country. In Toronto, Montreal, the other two big cities, Quebec, this year, Sécurité, a while back raided the 3 or 4 dispensaries in Montreal and shut them down. They're sort of back up, but they actually took some action. But again, that was more of a public relations exercise than anything.
Yeah. And you mentioned, just your, by anecdotal, 12 months ago to currently, there's been an explosion of dispensaries in Vancouver.
Yes, okay. Absolutely. Like it's something else to go and see them. And it's quite easy to walk in and buy some marijuana. You still need the doctor's authorization, but there are, some of these dispensaries have doctors, and I'm doing that in quotes, whether that's a naturopath on staff, and they'll give you the authorization. It's not necessarily 100% correct, but you can walk out of there within 40 minutes with your product.
And within 40 minutes, we're just going to leave that and talk about that another time. Sure. But because I want to get to the fact that what you're describing is a province which has determined its own kind of path, despite what the federal mandate is, and has a burgeoning industry operational that is growing exponentially. And what you are describing is basically Colorado in 2009, 2010. Yeah. It's striking the similarities between the two geographies, no?
Yes, absolutely. And the only sole difference is with the dispensaries, We have our licensed producer regime here, and unfortunately, that's the one frustrating thing. These companies can't sell to those dispensaries because since they're clearly outside the law, they would risk losing their license if they did. So you still don't know sort of, what's the product you're getting within the dispensary, and the dispensaries will say it's, quality controlled, etc. But again, and you're taking somebody's word for it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the licensed producers, they undergo a very strict regime of proving constantly that their supply is safe and secure.
Yeah.
So,
and what are we up to as far as licensed producers as we speak? It was 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. What is it?
I think we're at 19 now that can sell to Canadians, and we're at a total of 25 that have. The other 6 have license to cultivate, and will hopefully be getting into that next category where they can actually sell.
Okay, and then give us the timeline on that. Yeah, when do we think that that's going to come to be?
Well, you've got 19 operating right now, right? Mm-hmm. And so the next 6, I would imagine within the next year, and then hopefully more companies, just based on my client roster, will be migrating into that second to last phase of being able to cultivate first, and so that they make Health Canada happy that they can produce a decent product and will then be able to get their license to sell. Mm-hmm. But it's still a very lengthy process to get approval from Health Canada to become a licensed producer. Mm-hmm. And unfortunately, sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Unfortunately, it's still. It impacts the supply, the legal supply in the market, because I would think there are issues of, people still waiting and seeing whether they buy from an LP. They still feel, I believe, more comfortable either to grow it at home or, deal with the person they've been dealing with for a long time, perhaps.
Okay. All right. So now back to you, as far as your path and journey, you did the Health Canada thing. And then when you did leave the medical access process position, did you go straight into consulting or what was the path?
Yeah, no, I did. I had an opportunity to essentially leave the government, as it were, because they were going through a really massive series of downsizing. And I decided that, I'm in my 40s right now. If I ever want to take this opportunity to try to run my own shop, I guess, this is it, right? Either I make the decision now or I spend the rest of my career in the government. And I think, again, it's part of that idea where you want to try something different, because I'm fairly conservative when it comes to risk, and I never thought I would be doing this because I really enjoyed my government career, and there is a steady paycheck and a good pension, etc. But you can't, I guess, totally live your life with that as the end goal, and so I wanted to give this a try, and so I've been doing this since 2012.
And you've got, some clients in Canada, and what are most of them kind of coming to you with? What issues are they bringing to you?
Well, primarily right now, it's my practice was about pharmaceuticals and natural health products and medical devices and getting them through the regulatory process. But and I'm not complaining at all, but the marijuana side of things is totally taken over, and where I'm helping is in and around navigating that entire application process so they can get their license to produce and to sell. And a little bit of that is I'm also a registered lobbyist, so effectively doing some government relations work on this file also.
Excellent. And I do know that you also have at least one client in Australia. Is that not right?
Yes, I do. Yeah, and that's I'm part of a small think tank down there called the Cannabis Policy Project, and what's fascinating about Australia right now is they're undergoing a lot of change when it comes to this. So I guess they're where Canada was maybe 6 years ago. And so their states and their federal government are all looking into the feasibility of allowing the use of marijuana. And they've got various programs underway, various legislation is making its way through the federal government to see what they can do. And I think the big difference between our Conservative Prime Minister and their Conservative Prime Minister, even though he's called a Liberal, is that Tony Abbott, the Prime Minister of Australia, came out and said, well, I think if you're going to allow opioids, essentially, you can allow marijuana. I'm paraphrasing a bit, but that was his essential message. Now, the practice, of course, is something completely different.
Yeah, no, and how so though? Because if you've got essential sign off from the prime minister, what does that mean for their provinces or their states?
Well, again, that comes down to, it's, you can say one thing and do something else, right? And
Right.
so the idea is at least they're recognizing the issue, but I think it's about, okay, what are you implementing? What specifically are you going to do? Are you going to slow the process down? Mm-hmm. Or are you going to effectively implement something? And so, for instance, New South Wales, is, put in about $6 million into clinical trials. It's not a lot, but at least it's a start. It's a recognition. Mm-hmm. I think they've got another sort of 40 million set aside for some of that work. Victoria, which I find quite interesting as a state, that's sort of where Melbourne is. Mm-hmm. They elected a new sort of Labour premier in late 2014, and he's come out and said, "Well, I want to have some options about, what can we implement for medical marijuana." And so I believe he's asking the Victorian Law Commission to look into that, and they're going to report in August. Mm-hmm. So they've got some initiatives. And then there's a private members bill that actually has all party support in the federal Senate, mm-hmm. Led by the Greens. And it's proposing a sort of a federal regulator of medical cannabis, and it would be an operating agency that would approve use, set the conditions, set how much you can have, et cetera, et cetera. So that's working its way through also.
What's the timeline on that? Is that...
They should be reporting, in the next couple of weeks, actually. They received close to 155 submissions through their second reading. I mean, we certainly provided a submission mm-hmm. on what we thought of the bill. And so we'll see what happens after they report. And then, because it went to a committee, and then it'll have to go to a third reading and hopefully a vote. But I guess the idea is, where's the funding going to come from? And would the federal government ever put a veto on that? I'm not exactly sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, let's see what happens. But it does sound like there's some rulings coming down, this summer. So things will certainly change no matter what, right?
Yeah, I think it's promising, right? I mean, I think it's sort of the promising next market. But with a lot of caution obviously involved. I mean, one of the things that this industry has had a hard time with, I guess, is that immediate rush in and everybody thinking they were going to make a pile of money overnight. That's not going to happen. It's a long-term sort of industry, I hope, and there'll be long-term game. And I think Australia is in the same boat. It's not going to happen overnight. There's a lot of rules, regulations, and policies to be figured out, but it should be that way. But eventually, I think you'll see something on the ground for sure. For that, I'm optimistic for Australia as being the next kind of interesting market to emerge.
Yeah, very, very interesting. And then just speaking of rulings, let's go back to Canada as we close here. Recent Supreme Court ruling in Canada regarding infused products. You want to talk through that?
Yeah, that's a great sort of decision that came down. And I was able to talk to Jennifer Thorne, who's a lawyer out of BC, who's also in this space. And she provided me with a really good synopsis of it. And the ruling struck down sections, I believe, 4 and 5 of the Controlled Drugs and Substances Act. And that's what the Supreme Court was asked to look at. And that's essentially, what are the offenses and what's punishable and what is possession for marijuana. And they said now possession for the derivative products. And the Supreme Court said, okay, that's great. You can possess it and you won't be charged with it. The problem, though, with that ruling is, and this is the issue that the Supreme Court was only asked to look at those two issues, is it's silent, that decision on distribution and how you produce it. So we're about, I would say, 50% of the way there. And, one of my clients gave me this great metaphor about looking at it. It's sort of like, you're told you can have eggs, but you can't have the chicken.
I see.
Yeah.
Well, then that does answer that age-old question, though.
I guess so. I guess so.
The eggs do come first, so that's good.
So I think it's a great step, but again, it's never the complete story, unfortunately, and we'll have to see how the federal government's going to respond.
Yeah, and what is the just overarching whole story as you see it as far as Canada is concerned with a timeline, understanding that you've got your conservative government that is not necessarily enthused by all of this. What do you think? Where do you think we're going over the next 6-12 months?
Well, 6 to 12 months, geez, that's a hard one. I mean, we have an election in October of this year. I mean, even if the Conservatives get reelected, I think you're you're still going to have the same sort of process in dealing with Health Canada. That's not going to change overnight if you had a change in government. The one thing, at least with these court rulings, is you can't put the genie back in the bottle. So you can't all of a sudden say tomorrow it's illegal, right?
Right.
So there's always going to be some sort of process or industry in place. It just depends on how quickly it can develop. And I think, optimistically, we're still, like any brand new industry, you're 5 years out, right? And we've already seen some mergers and acquisitions within the Canadian industry because, revenues are not there necessarily, but companies are working hard to enroll patients. And I think companies, the companies that can continually produce a consistent product and meet their consumer demand will be the ones that capture the larger market share.
Okay. Well, that's obvious. I mean, not obvious, but I think that is at least a cogent thought on your part.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
All right. Well, let's get to the final two questions. We ask these questions of everybody. At least we try to, and they are the same. At least they sound the same. What has most surprised you in cannabis, and what has most surprised you in life? So before we get to those two questions, though, I know from a past conversation, I know that you, in the beginning of your year, worked on the Canada-Chile Free Trade Agreement at a very, very low level because you were very, very young at the time. But is that not the case?
Yeah, no, it was. I worked before I started the federal government. When I was in university, I worked for a firm called Townsend Trade Strategies, and they were contracted by the government to look into the free trade agreement, but within the specific section of the labor sort of agreements that Chile had implemented when it came to the ILO, the International Labor Organization. And so, I was hired to do a lot of research onto that, and that was a really fun time because I think that was one of my first serious jobs I had, right? And I was paid to sort of think and do some research, and I never got to go to Chile, though my boss did, but it was great being a part of that.
Did your boss meet Pinochet or no?
No, no. At that time, the democracy, they had their first elected government, so I guess Pinochet was a senator, like a senator, lifelong senator at that time. But she did get to meet a lot of new ministers at that point. Okay.
All right, I just wanted to make sure that we covered the fact that Pinochet has come up along your career when we assess these final questions. So, you've done a lot with marijuana. You've battled the use of an H. What has most surprised you in cannabis?
I think actually, and I'm sure there are people that disagree with me, but just how far the country's come. I know it seems like a long time since 2000 to 2015, but I certainly never thought we would have, the industry that we have today in Canada. I know, you guys in the U.S. were way ahead of us, but even if we had had let's say, a fairly liberal government on that side, I thought it would have taken much longer. But, I'm surprised, and I am. The other thing I am surprised on the flip side, though, is the views of Canadians, I think, are the same as Americans, where you've got anywhere between 70 to 80% who are saying, will you just allow this, not necessarily from a recreational point of view, but from a medical point of view. And in that sense, I'm a little disappointed in the way the government's behaving. I can get the concern from a regulatory point of view, but I think we've moved on now. And when you look at all the harmful things out there, right, and I'm talking about opioids or alcohol in that sense, I think marijuana, and tobacco, et cetera, can be placed in that category, but I think there's a lot more research that needs to be done and can be done. And let's see what it proves out to be. But let's not have this blanket prohibition where, we're back in the 30s and it's marijuana madness or reefer madness or whatever it was called.
Exactly. All right. So good thoughts there. What has most surprised you in life, sir?
That I'm actually an entrepreneur to some degree. I mean, like I said, public service was a big part of my career, and I think, my dad would be proud, and certainly my mother. I never thought I would take the plunge, but I surprised myself because I am, fairly a conservative guy. You always got to worry about that next paycheck, but I've just really been enjoying myself like a lot over the last couple of years.
Excellent. Well, you're doing great work. We'll check in with you again about your thoughts on Canada and Australia. And of course, we'll see you in just a few months at Cannabis Economy in Vancouver.
That's great, Seth. Thanks again.
All right. There you have it. Ivan Ross Vrana, basically sharing with us that Vancouver is very much Colorado in 2010. So right now in Vancouver, it kind of feels like Colorado did in 2010. There are obvious differences because it's not the same country, but that's awfully interesting. Also interesting to hear about Australia. Hope you enjoyed.